"Well, Mr. Holmes, have you proved us to be wrong yet?" cried Lestrade. "I have formed no conclusion whatever," my companion answered. Lestrade laughed loudly. "Step this way, if you please, gentlemen, and I think I can convince you once for all that it was John McFarlane who did this crime." He led us through the passage and out into a dark hall beyond. "This is where young McFarlane must have come out to get his hat after the crime was done," said he. "Now look at this." With dramatic suddenness, he struck a match, and by its light exposed a stain of blood upon the whitewashed wall. As he held the match nearer, I saw that it was more than a stain. It was the well-marked print of a thumb. "Look at that with your magnifying glass, Mr. Holmes." "Yes, I am doing so." "You are aware that no two thumb marks are alike?" "I have heard something of the kind." "Well then, will you please compare that print with this wax impression of young McFarlane's right thumb taken by my orders this morning?" As he held the waxen print close to the bloodstain, it did not take a magnifying glass to see that the two were undoubtedly from the same thumb. "That is final," said Lestrade. "Yes, that is final," I involuntarily echoed. "It is final," said Holmes. I've been a fan of Sherlock Holmes my whole life since I was a wee bairn. My favourite on-screen iteration is Basil Rathbone from the 1930s and 1940s, followed by Jeremy Brett and Ian Richardson from the 1980s. Sorry, Cumberbitches, I'm a Rathboner. The passage I've just read to you has always fascinated me. It comes from the short story The Adventure of the Norwood Builder, which was published on the 31st of October 1903, but is set in 1894. Now, what struck me about it is that in this passage, Sherlock Holmes, the master detective who in previous stories pioneered the use of handprints and footprints in detection and invented forensic tests that even the police were unable to comprehend, seems familiar with, but far from expert in, the concept of fingerprinting. Which got me thinking, if in 1894 Sherlock Holmes wasn't au fait with fingerprinting, then when did fingerprinting first come into use? It's important to remember just how widespread the use of fingerprinting technology is. We're all familiar with its use to identify culprits in criminal investigations, but it's also used for security access in banks, for accurately identifying patients in healthcare, and even just for clocking into businesses. And if you'd told me 20 years ago that one day I'll be able to unlock my mobile phone and even my front door with just my thumbprint, I'd have told you to pull down your tin hat and shove that alien probe back up your ass. Fingerprint technology is gradually and inexorably becoming ubiquitous. As an industry, it's estimated to be worth $13 billion today and is projected to be worth $33.4 billion by 2026. This is because it's the most accurate way to distinguish a person's identity. People can easily change their appearance over time, whether by growing and losing hair, getting wrinkles, having cosmetic surgery, wearing contact lenses, and so on. You might think DNA analysis is the most conclusive way to identify a person, but not only can it take months to analyze samples, whereas fingerprint checks take mere minutes, but it can cost as much as 400 times more than fingerprinting, and can fail to tell close relatives apart. This is famously demonstrated by the West case of 1903. When Will West was sent to Leavenworth Penitentiary, the guards found that he was already a prisoner on their records. It turned out that his identical twin brother William West was also a prisoner at Leavenworth, and the only way to tell them apart was by their fingerprints. Even though DNA hadn't been discovered in 1903, it wouldn't have helped because they were identical twins with indistinguishable DNA. Although I can't shake the feeling they were trying to be awkward. I mean, calling themselves Will and William, come on. No two people have yet been discovered to have the same fingerprints. In fact, in 1892, Sir Francis Galton calculated the odds of two different people having the same pattern of ridges as 1 in 64 billion. What's more, unlike everything else about the human body's exterior, fingerprints don't change as we age. The only way your fingerprints can't give you away is if you chop off all your digits or scar them all somehow. In criminal cases, fingerprinting is the most commonly used forensic evidence in the world, more than all the other forensic lab techniques combined. Training programs and conferences provided by the International Association for Identification and Interpol keep best practices and quality control in place. Interpol was set up in 1923 and the IAI was founded in 1915, so we know that fingerprinting was a globally established practice by the First World War, 11 years after Sherlock Holmes was confronting his thumbprint. But finger marks were solving literary murders as early as 1883 in Mark Twain's probably embellished memoir, Life on the Mississippi. The first real-life crime to be solved by fingerprints was in Argentina. On the 29th of June, 1892, Ponciano Carabello came home to find his wife and 2 children in bed, their throats cut. The children were dead, but his wife Francisca was just about alive. She said their neighbor, Ramon Velasquez, had attacked them when she refused his sexual advances. Velasquez was arrested and tortured by police, but Velasquez wouldn't confess. So Inspector Eduardo Alvarez went to the crime scene and found a fingerprint on the window in dried blood. He then took Francisca's fingerprints, and they matched. She immediately confessed to killing the children and cutting her own throat in a murder-suicide attempt. But the thing is, fingerprints are only useful evidence if you have a well-organized filing system where you can record them and find them for comparison. Today, Interpol uses a digital database known as the Automatic Fingerprint Identification System, but this still partly uses principles of the Henry system, named after Edward Richard Henry, who introduced it to Britain in 1900. New Scotland Yard adopted it when they founded their fingerprint branch in 1901, which trained the man who introduced fingerprinting to New York in 1902. The Henry system was later adapted by the FBI, whose database now holds the fingerprints of more than 162 million people, both criminals and civilians. And that's not even the largest biometric database in the world. India's Aadhaar database has over 1.2 billion people registered on it. Then again, that's just officially the largest. Edward Henry's system proved so successful that he was rewarded with a knighthood. He developed the system in 1897 to speed up the process of searching through fingerprint records that was developed by Sir Francis Galton. Remember him? Although Galton was only interested in fingerprints as a way of implementing his theory of eugenics. What once took an hour under Galton's system now took 5 minutes under Henry's. According to author Colin Bevan, Henry claimed to have come up with his classification system in a eureka moment while travelling on a train. In reality, he was helped by Azizul Haque and Hem Chandra Bose. Haque was a formerly homeless errand boy who invented the mathematical formula for filing that made it much easier to compare a suspect's prints to the records. Hem Chandra Bose was a detective who came up with the values for features of prints that would be fed into Haque's formula. This system involved noting the shape of the print. Is it a wall, a loop, or an arch? Together, they became founding members of the world's first fingerprint bureau in Calcutta. Neither of them received credit for their work on the Henry system until they complained, with the help of journalists, in 1925. But this wasn't the beginning of India's history with fingerprinting. 39 years earlier, in 1858, the Chief Magistrate of the Hooghly district in Jangipur in Bengal, Sir William Herschel, spontaneously asked a local businessman to sign a contract with his handprint instead of a signature, because people in the district had a habit of ducking out of contracts by claiming their signatures had been forged. Herschel didn't intend to use the prints to establish identity, though. He just wanted to play on the local superstition that physical contact with a document was more binding than a signature. Nevertheless, he made the first ever practical use of initially handprints and then fingerprints for signing contracts. Yay, capitalism? Eventually, Herschel noticed that the fingerprints he was collecting were unique, and he made a habit of collecting his own fingerprints throughout his life to prove that they didn't change with age. But he wasn't the first to observe the singularity of fingerprints. German scientist Johann Mayer noted that in the 18th century, and a British village doctor called Robert Blake Overton suggested using fingerprints to solve a murder in 1840. But collecting fingerprints at crime scenes is tricky, unless the culprit dips their hands in blood or another sticky substance. Get your mind out the gutter. You have to find latent prints. That is, invisible prints made by the body's natural oils on surfaces or skin. Today, police use ultraviolet or infrared light to find latent prints, and special powders to lift them, but this was a big challenge back in the day. The first person to identify a latent fingerprint was Dr. Henry Faulds, a Scottish missionary living in Tokyo, who noticed one on a bottle of alcohol. He suggested it could be used to catch criminals, and wrote to Scotland Yard and famous naturalist Charles Darwin about it. Scotland Yard wasn't interested, and Darwin said, "Sorry, can't help you, mate," but he did forward Faulds' idea to his cousin and aspiring racial exterminator, Sir Francis Galton. Him again. Galton then wrote his book about fingerprints and their use in criminal investigations, and was visited by Edward Henry in 1894, who then went back to India with an idea to develop the system of fingerprint classification that we still use across the globe today. It's a small world when you're an English aristocrat. So, when Sherlock Holmes and Inspector Lestrade study a thumbprint in a story set in 1894, they were ahead of their time, at least in the sense that by that point in history only one policeman, in Argentina, had used fingerprints to solve a crime. But when Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote the story in 1903, fingerprints were all the rage, being adopted by police forces all over the world, inspired by Scotland Yard, who took the methods from India. However, the seemingly modern phenomenon of using fingerprints to identify someone may actually date back to ancient Babylon. King Hammurabi sealed official documents with his fingerprints almost 3,000 years ago. The ancient Chinese also sealed scrolls using fingerprints, and a Chinese document from 200 BC describes how handprints were used to solve a burglary. So, ultimately, it took over a century's worth of research by European scientists to rediscover what the ancient Chinese and Babylonians already knew. And that, in a nutshell, is the history of fingerprinting. Thanks for making it to the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, then please do consider giving us a like, subscribe, and sharing it with your friends. Click the bell notification if you haven't already to keep up to date on all of our future videos. In addition to these video essays, we do regular podcasts. The full podcast goes up on podcast platforms of your choice, but the excerpts of the main discussions go up on the YouTube channel. It's a new experiment we're trying. Thank you to all of our patrons and YouTube members for supporting the channel. We really couldn't do it without you, and we're particularly grateful for it in these hard times. You really do keep us going. So thanks again, and we'll see you next time.